I made a test. I wanted to see Clark Gable at the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and they wouldn't let me in. So some kid came along and says, hey, they got 75 guys on the back lot there making a test for Tarzan. Go back and make a test, and they let you in the studio. So I went back and made the test, and the guy says, can you run? I said, sure, I can run.
Hollywood celebrates craft, but the golden age kept proving another law. Presence wins. A roar stood in for dialogue. A stare carried the weight of a confession. A jawline did more work than pages of script. Image shaped by studios, timing and myth often outran technique. 15 names illustrate the pattern. Athletes who moved like headlines, idols built in publicity rooms, cool operators whose silence felt dangerous. Some careers floated on beauty, others on authenticity, so narrow it became a cage. Critics balked. The box office didn't. Charisma converted doubt into tickets, then into memory. Fame, in that era, behaved like gravity around a single trait: strength, stillness, danger, elegance, and everything else orbited it. Reviews faded, posters lingered. Decades later, the legends remain, not because the performances were deep, but because the images were unforgettable. Johnny Weissmuller, an Olympic resume, did the early heavy lifting. Records, headlines, a body that photographed like architecture. Casting him as Tarzan converted athletic physics into screen grammar. The yell became punctuation, the vine swing a thesis statement, the river dive an encore. Dialogue turned into decoration because movement was already telling the story. Studios recognized the arithmetic. Spectacle plus myth out-earned nuance, and Weissmuller's silhouette carried both. Action scenes played like proof-of-concept reels for his own legend, each leap reaffirming that credibility can be physical before it is verbal. The camera didn't ask for inner life when outer life read that clearly. Critics debated range, ticket buyers didn't. The persona stabilized into a brand where limitations served the image: quiet lines, loud presence, an elemental simplicity that resisted notes. In a marketplace that rewards certainty, he provided the most cinematic kind, a body that never needed a close-up to be believed. Jean Harlow, platinum hair, wicked timing, and a voice tuned to flirt with the edge. Harlow transmuted light into attitude. The screen didn't just catch her, it reflected off her, turning small gestures into headlines. Subtext arrived as a smirk, subplots arrived as a shoulder tilt. Restraint was never the assignment. Marketing called her a bombshell, but the performance style preceded the label. Lines landed like winks, innocence arrived with a warning label. The craft critique, too broad, too bright, missed the point that brightness was the medium. Audiences came for voltage, not shading, and voltage has a way of flattening objections. The result was a persona that didn't chase depth so much as disarm it. Scenes bent toward her center of gravity, and partners became foils for the glow. If acting is sometimes the art of being necessary, Harlow made necessity look effortless. A chemistry experiment where charisma is the only reagent that matters. Chuck Norris, stoicism hardened into style, a still frame, a measured turn, and the roundhouse that functioned as narrative closure. Emotional topography stayed level, which in action grammar reads as control. The camera learned the cadence and organized itself around the inevitability of impact. Cultural aftershocks did the rest. The archetype escaped its films and became folklore, proof that simplicity scales better than nuance in the collective imagination. One expression translated into 1,000 jokes and the same number of endorsements, each reinforcing the original silhouette. On screen, the bargain remained consistent: fewer lines, cleaner promise. The persona delivered certainty at speed, and certainty is a currency audiences spend without hesitation. Range never entered the contract, inevitability did, and it paid on time. Gene Kelly, dance converted into narrative, and narrative into joy. Athletic lines, buoyant tempo, and a grin that read like permission turned whole sequences into proof that movement can carry emotion without heavy speech. When the body spoke clearly, words risked redundancy. The imbalance was visible the second the music stopped. Charisma still pulsed, but the voltage came from motion. Dialogue felt like a cool-down lap. In musical grammar, that's not a flaw so much as a specialization. Velocity as character, rhythm as intention. Studios built vehicles that honored the calculus: more choreography, fewer confessions. The legacy followed suit. Technique on the acting axis stayed narrow. On the kinetic axis, it rewrote the genre and left a trail of scenes that still feel airborne. Maureen O'Hara. Presence arrived armored, composure like tempered glass, color that conquered technicolor, and a voice trimmed to a fine edge. Fragility rarely entered the frame, and when it did, it yielded quickly to command. The result was majesty first, Vulnerability last. Critics asked for fissures, audiences accepted the fortress. Roles leaned into the regal posture, foregrounding will over wobble. Intensity came not from breakdowns but from standoffs. Chin up, shoulders squared, emotion expressed as refusal to yield. Range in the conventional key remained tight, yet the iconography proved durable because it solved a cinematic need, an image of strength that photographed beautifully and read instantly. Power glazed in glamour, traveled farther than softness ever could in those frames. George Raft. Authenticity functioned like both passport and prison. The manner, the stare, the way a suit hung on a man who knew rooms where threats were currency. Everything signaled credibility. Casting followed that signal until options narrowed to one temperature. Missed turns hardened into legend. Roles declined out of caution or preference landed elsewhere, and made other careers. The look that sold the tough guy myth also kept the compass fixed, and repetition dulled what realism first sharpened. What remained was a persona so convincing it felt documentary, valuable, bankable, and resistant to reinvention. In an industry that rewards transformation, constancy paid, until it didn't, leaving a perfectly etched mask that would not change its expression. Tab Hunter. Studio machinery minted an ideal and gave it a timetable. The right lighting, the right angles, the right headlines arriving exactly when the market needed a clean, photogenic daydream. Symmetry did more work than subtext. Stillness translated as innocence. A carefully measured smile stood in for revelation. Performance stayed within narrow borders because the packaging, posters, fan columns, radio singles was already carrying most of the load, and the lens rewarded the calm that didn't threaten the brand. The machine proved efficient. Publicity multiplied the image across media until the persona became infrastructure, dependable, repeatable, instantly legible. Scripts asked for presence rather than excavation, and presence arrived on time. Critics tallied limits, exhibitors tallied receipts. What looked thin in close analysis looked perfectly engineered in the weekly grosses, which is the metric that keeps phones ringing. Time added perspective the studio years didn't allow. Later candor reframed the myth, revealing the strain of living inside an image that set strict rules about who to be and how to be seen. That contrast, high-gloss facade against private negotiations, became the work that registered most deeply in retrospect, recasting a poster boy story as a study in control, constraint, and the long shadow of a brand that once seemed effortless. Steve Reeves' physique functioned as thesis, costume as exclamation point. The camera treated posture like plot and lines of muscle like declarative sentences, composing frames where a turn of the shoulders conveyed more certainty than any speech could. In the peplum cycle, every tableau resolved into a statement. Lift the column, draw the bow, hold the gaze, and the scene was essentially complete before the first dubbed syllable arrived. Directors leaned into the physics. Shots lingered to let statuesque geometry do its work. Choreography favored clarity over complexity. Conflict was staged as a series of living frescoes. The effect made dialogue ornamental and turned limitation into house style. Range on the conventional acting axis remained tight, but range on the pictorial axis, silhouette, stance, rhythm, expanded into a signature strong enough to travel across borders and languages. The legacy sits at the intersection of camp and purity. These films can read as oversized and earnest, yet the commitment to a simple legible idea, strength rendered as picture, still lands with force. The audience bargain proved durable, arrive for spectacle, leave with a memory of shapes and light arranged to look inevitable. It's cinema as sculpture in motion, and Reeves supplied the marble the genre needed. Victor mature. Charm preceded every entrance and did most of the lifting after it. The tan, the grin, the relaxed carriage, each element signaled that the picture would move smoothly, even if the performance didn't hunt for nuance. Self-awareness helped. A willingness to joke about limited range disarmed the sharpest critiques and reframed the conversation from depth to company, a category he occupied comfortably for years. Historical epics and melodramas wrapped around the presence, using scale to amplify what the persona already promised: easy authority, handsome certainty, the suggestion that storms would pass on schedule. Dialogue often took the shortest route from point A to point B, which kept the temperature even and left the heavy weather to costumes, music, and architecture. The result wasn't revelation but reliability, a trait casting agents value more than essayists do. What endures is the clarity of the bargain. The screen got a likable constant who could anchor pulp and prestige environments alike, and audiences got a matinee companion who never asked for too much attention while holding a frame with unforced confidence. Limited range didn't sink the career because the roles didn't require more, they required exactly that steadiness, delivered with a wink that said the job description had been read and accepted. Dorothy Lamour. Fantasy operated as first principle. A warm contralto, playful humor, and the signature sarong combined into an instantly legible escape hatch, especially potent during anxious years when audiences prized ease over experimentation. Characters rarely demanded transformation, they demanded glow, and glow arrived on cue, wrapping thin plots in a soft-focused promise of good time. The road to cycle turned that promise into a formula. Chemistry with co-stars did the heavy lifting, while L'Amour calibrated allure to a friendly register suggestive without edge, witty without sting. Variation lived in ornamentation. A wink, a lyric, a costume that implied paradise even when the backdrop was painted. Consistency, not range, secured the marquee. Longevity came from recognizability. The brand Tropical Radiance with a gentle laugh proved exportable across films, radio, and stage, functioning like a reliable melody in a changing market. Critical demands for reinvention never mattered as much as delivery on mood, and mood remained her most bankable line. Alan Ladd. Silence became the signature. A low-level voice and a gaze that refused to blink under pressure produced a moral temperature cooler than most leads could sustain. Emotion registered as minor shifts, jaw set, eyes narrowing, inviting the frame to do the underlining. In noir and westerns, that minimalism read as lethal focus. Directors wrote scenes around negative space. Dialogue pared down to essentials. Blocking protected the aura. Supporting players carried explanatory weight so Ladd could conserve voltage for decisive moments. What some called limited, the camera interpreted as compression, the kind that makes every spare line feel heavier than it looks on the page. The afterimage is precision rather than breadth. Roles blend into a single silhouette, compact, contained, and harder than circumstance, yet the silhouette remains iconic because it solves a cinematic equation. Suspense increases when the center barely moves. Control substitutes for color, and control photographs beautifully. Troy Donahue. The image arrived finished. Sunlit hair, untroubled posture, and a gaze composed for romance. Spreads defined the commodity before a frame of dialogue unspooled. Scripts positioned desire as atmosphere and let Donahue stand at the eye of it, absorbing projection while offering minimal resistance, a method perfectly compatible with teen melodrama's soft focus. Market cycles exposed the bargain's limits. As tastes shifted toward grit and psychological density, the stillness that once read as dreamy began to read as hollow. Roles thinned, and the star system that manufactured heartthrobs on schedule moved on to a new template. The face remained photogenic, the context withdrew. Nostalgia stabilized the legacy. The look became shorthand for a moment in American pop culture, when surfaces promised safety and movies sold it at scale. Even as range remained circumscribed, the emblem retained value, a poster that still explains its own era in a single glance. Joan Bennett. Elegance operated as armor and invitation at once, sculpted diction, immaculate posture, and a gaze that registered not heat but temperature control. In frames tuned to shadow and suggestion, she radiated a poised remove that read as power, withholding just enough to make motive feel like a riddle rather than a confession. The effect created an optical illusion of depth. Audiences studied the calm and found intrigue, while the performance itself stayed deliberately cool, a portrait that refused to blur even when the plot demanded friction. Directors leveraged that poise as architecture. Scenes arranged themselves around her equilibrium, letting menacing glances and velveted retorts do the heavy work that a breakdown might do in a louder film. Emotion, when it surfaced, arrived like a hairline crack across porcelain, visible, consequential, and quickly reabsorbed by composure. The narrowness of the register became the point. Restraint photographed like intelligence, and intelligence doubled as allure in genres built from secrets and doubts. The legacy is a silhouette that critics still parse for minimal adjustments, a head tilt as verdict, a half-smile as treaty, a closing of the eyes as exit wound. If the classical acting checklist insists on crescendos and floods, Bennett's pages stay mostly dry, but the ink stains anyway. Control, duplicated across roles, became a signature that outlasted the era that minted it, proof that cool can be its own kind of voltage when the camera is listening for quiet. Buster Crabbe. Achievement preceded performance. Olympic medals, a body engineered for velocity, and a stance that made heroism look like posture rather than psychology. The serials converted those traits into ritual, packaging courage as cliffhanger rhythm. Enter, announce, confront, advance. So the weekly pilgrimage needed conviction more than nuance. Cardboard planets and papier-mâché perils felt sturdier when framed by a jawline that believed, and belief is the most valuable special effect in low-budget space. Line readings often traveled at a different speed from the action, as if the water-trained body moved in present tense while the voice arrived from half a second behind. Yet the dissonance played in matinee acoustics where children supplied missing emotion and the schematics of heroism didn't require internal weather. The earnest glare, the purposeful stride, the ready salute became mnemonic devices. Each beat taught the grammar of adventure to audiences willing to recite it back every Saturday. What remains is a museum of sincerity, frames that refuse irony, gestures that never wink, a hero costume inhabited with absolute faith in tin rockets and moral clarity. Range stayed short, but the signal carried far because the transmitter never flickered. In the long archive of fantasy, Crabbe's chapters endure as proof that conviction can waterproof cheap sets, and that a straight line, walked without hesitation, maps a universe large enough for memory. David Carradine. Stillness arrived like a thesis about attention. The voice took the low road, the eyes did half the speaking, and the body moved as if time had been asked to slow down and accepted the invitation. In that hush, small gestures swelled, an eyelid lowering like a curtain, a palm opening like a gate, and audiences projected wisdom into the blank spaces that more demonstrative actors might have filled with emphasis. The ambiguity proved magnetic. Serenity read as depth until it read as drift, and the line between the two shifted from scene to scene like heat on a road. Roles that harmonized with the aura made the quiet feel inevitable. Philosophical wanderers, melancholy masters, men who knew more than they said and said less than they knew. The writing wrapped around the cadence and treated absence as content. When scripts demanded propulsion or confession, the method could look like undercranking, a trance resistant to plot velocity. Yet the paradox, half profound, half somnolent, became the signature the culture recognized, a mood that critics debated and the camera continued to trust. Later reframings amplified the myth. Filmmakers repurposed the calm as menace or melancholy, turning the whisper into a blade and the pause into a verdict. The performance palette remained narrow, but the timbre aged into something unmistakable, a presence that bends rooms towards silence and forces the frame to breathe at its pace. In a business that equates volume with value, Carradine demonstrated how a nearly motionless needle can still redraw the compass. Charisma keeps winning where craft is supposed to. The pattern is plain, a single trait: strength, stillness, beauty, danger, becomes gravitational, and the industry learns to orbit it. Studios package the magnet into ritual, critics object to the limits, and ticket lines answer the objection. Image proves durable because it is easy to recognize and easy to sell. Nuance is harder to photograph and slower to spread. What looks thin under a microscope can roar inside a theater. An athlete's motion reads as conviction, a sculpted silhouette reads as destiny, a velvet chill reads as intelligence, a jawline reads as promise. Marketing multiplies those signals until they feel inevitable, and inevitability is the closest thing Hollywood has to truth. Range, in many of these cases, stays narrow by design, not a failure of imagination so much as a system selecting for clarity over complexity. Decades later, the residue is iconography, posters that outlived reviews, gestures that became shorthand, faces that still decode entire eras on sight. The Golden Age did not merely tolerate limited acting, it engineered frameworks where limitation functioned as style. That is the secret running beneath these 15 careers. The camera will forgive almost anything if the image satisfies a need. Craft wins prizes, presence writes memory. Which of these 15 felt most unforgettable despite limited range, and who belongs on the list next?